For more than 3 decades, Céline Dion appeared almost untouchable. Her voice was not just admired, it was worshipped. Millions of people around the world saw her as the definition of strength, elegance, and perfection. Night after night, she stood under blinding lights, delivering emotional performances that seemed impossible for an ordinary human being. She sold out arenas, dominated radio charts, and built one of the most successful careers the music industry had ever seen. But behind that legendary voice was a woman quietly breaking apart. Now at 58, the tragedy surrounding Céline Dion feels far more devastating than fans ever imagined. Because when people look back at her life today, they no longer see only the glamorous superstar who sang, "My Heart Will Go On." They see someone who spent decades carrying enormous emotional pain, while desperately trying to protect the people around her from seeing it. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is this. For years, the world applauded her strength without realizing how fragile she truly was. Long before fame entered her life, Céline's childhood was already shaped by hardship. She was born into a large working-class family in Charlemagne, Quebec, as the youngest of 14 children. Their home was crowded, noisy, and financially strained. Privacy barely existed. Luxury was unimaginable. Yet music became the one thing that united the family together. Even as a little girl, Céline's voice stood out in ways people could not ignore. Family members reportedly stopped conversations just to listen to her sing. There was something unusually emotional in her voice, even before she fully understood the meaning behind the lyrics. While other children dreamed casually about becoming famous, Céline's talent felt almost destined for something bigger. Still, talent alone was not enough. Her family lacked the money and industry connections needed to launch a music career. Everything changed when her mother and brother helped create a demo tape and sent it to music manager René Angélil. According to the story repeated for decades, René was so overwhelmed after hearing Céline sing that he cried immediately. That moment would completely alter her life forever. René became far more than a manager. He became the architect of her future. He reportedly mortgaged his home to finance her first recordings because he believed so strongly in her potential. Under his guidance, Céline transformed from a shy French-Canadian teenager into an international phenomenon. At first, their story sounded beautiful, almost like a fairy tale. He believed in her before anyone else did. He protected her career carefully. He shaped every detail of her public image with obsessive precision. But as years passed, some people began quietly questioning the emotional complexity of their relationship. After all, René had known Céline since she was only a child. The significant age difference between them drew attention once their romance became public. Critics debated whether the emotional dependence between the two had become unusually intense. Yet Céline never allowed criticism of René. She defended him constantly and described him as the love of her life. To her, he was everything: manager, protector, mentor, husband, emotional anchor. And that level of emotional attachment would later become one of the deepest sources of pain in her entire life. By the 1990s, Céline Dion was no longer simply successful. She had become a global institution. Her albums sold in massive numbers across continents. Interviews, tours, recordings, television specials, award shows. Her life became an endless cycle of performance and pressure. Most celebrities eventually cracked under that level of exposure. But Céline kept going. What made her unique was the way she constantly prioritized everyone else before herself. Fans adored her because she seemed genuine in an industry often accused of being fake. She cried openly during interviews. She spoke emotionally about family and gratitude. She never tried to appear cold or untouchable. But looking back now, many fans believe those emotional moments revealed something deeper. Exhaustion, loneliness, fear. Despite becoming one of the biggest stars in the world, Céline's personal happiness often appeared tied entirely to the people she loved rather than her own well-being. Fame itself never seemed to satisfy her emotionally. What mattered most was family, especially René. And then came the diagnosis that changed everything. When René Angélil was diagnosed with throat cancer, Céline's carefully constructed world reportedly began collapsing behind closed doors. Suddenly, the man who had guided her entire life was fighting for survival. Friends close to the family later described how devoted Céline became to caring for him personally. She reduced work commitments. She stepped away from parts of her career. She focused almost entirely on keeping him comfortable and alive. But the emotional burden was crushing. Imagine trying to nurse your dying husband while simultaneously remaining one of the most recognizable celebrities on earth. Cameras followed her constantly. Fans expected perfection every time she appeared in public. Yet privately, fear consumed her life. And still she performed. That is what makes old concert footage so painful for many fans today. While audiences saw glamour and confidence, Celine was often carrying overwhelming grief inside. She sang songs about love while watching the person she loved most slowly disappear. Some fans now notice moments where she appeared emotionally drained long before the public understood why. Her eyes sometimes looked distant during interviews. Her emotional reactions became stronger. Her vulnerability became impossible to hide completely. Then came the devastating year that shattered her emotionally. In January 2016, René Angélil died after a long battle with cancer. Celine was destroyed. But the nightmare became even worse only days later when her brother Daniel also passed away from cancer. Losing two deeply important people almost back-to-back reportedly left her in unimaginable emotional pain. Yet even during this horrific period, she tried to stay strong publicly. Fans remember her speaking through tears. They remember her trembling during memorial appearances. They remember the heartbreaking effort it took for her simply to continue functioning in front of cameras. And somehow, despite all of that grief, she returned to performing. Many people now believe music became less about fame for Celine and more about survival. Singing may have been the only thing preventing her from completely collapsing emotionally. The stage gave her structure. It gave her purpose. It allowed her to escape grief temporarily. But tragedy was not finished with her yet. Years later, fans began noticing disturbing changes. Concert cancellations increased. Her weight dropped dramatically. Videos circulated online showing stiffness in her movements. During some appearances, her body language looked unusually tense and uncomfortable. Rumors exploded across social media. Some people assumed exhaustion. Others feared addiction or secret illness. The truth turned out to be far worse. Eventually, Céline Dion revealed she had been diagnosed with stiff person syndrome, an extremely rare neurological disorder that causes severe muscle rigidity, painful spasms, and loss of physical control. For most people, the diagnosis would already feel terrifying. But for Céline Dion, it was especially cruel. Her body had become the instrument behind her entire identity. Her voice, posture, breathing, and movement were all essential to her ability to perform. Suddenly, the very thing she had relied on her entire life was betraying her. And the condition did not just threaten her career. It threatened her independence. Fans were devastated watching videos where she described struggling to walk properly or control muscle spasms. The woman who once commanded massive stadiums now spoke about physical pain with heartbreaking honesty. Even more tragic was realizing how long she may have hidden the suffering before speaking publicly, because that had become the pattern of her entire life. Céline Dion kept enduring pain silently, while trying to protect everyone else from worrying about her. And now, for the first time, the world is finally seeing just how much suffering she carried behind that legendary smile. As the reality of Céline Dion's condition became public, fans around the world began revisiting old interviews, performances, and public appearances with completely different eyes. Moments that once seemed minor suddenly looked deeply alarming. Small trembles, sudden pauses, emotional breakdowns during interviews, the stiffness in her posture, the visible exhaustion hidden beneath professional smiles. Many realized that Celine had likely been suffering in silence for much longer than anyone understood. And that revelation made her story even more heartbreaking. For years, she continued trying to perform despite worsening symptoms. According to people close to the situation, there were days when muscle spasms became so severe that even basic movement was difficult. Yet she reportedly pushed herself beyond normal physical limits because walking away from music felt emotionally impossible. Performing was never just a job for Céline Dion. It was her identity. Without the stage, many fans believe she felt lost. That is why the cancellation of her tours became such an emotional turning point. Publicly, announcements were carefully worded and professional. But behind the scenes, sources described a woman devastated by the realization that her body could no longer obey her the way it once had. Imagine spending your entire life mastering your voice and physical control only to suddenly lose both. For someone else, retirement might have been painful. For Celine, it felt like losing herself completely. Fans especially noticed the emotional pain in her voice during the rare moments she addressed her illness publicly. She tried to remain composed, but the sadness was impossible to hide. At times, she appeared to be fighting tears while explaining that singing had become physically difficult. That alone shattered millions of people emotionally. Because for decades, Céline Dion's voice represented strength, hope, romance, and survival. People played her songs during weddings, funerals, breakups, and personal tragedies. Her music carried people through the hardest moments of their lives. Now the woman behind those songs was fighting for her own survival. And sadly, the emotional isolation surrounding chronic illness can become unbearable, especially for someone who once lived constantly surrounded by applause and admiration. Several insiders have suggested that Celine's private emotional struggles became much worse after René's death. Friends reportedly worried that she never fully recovered psychologically from losing him. Even years later, she continued speaking about him in deeply emotional ways, almost as if part of her life had frozen permanently in grief. Some fans even noticed that after René passed away, Celine's appearance and personality slowly changed. She became thinner, more emotionally fragile, sometimes unusually quiet in interviews, at other times intensely emotional. There were moments when fans expressed concern online, but those worries were often dismissed as gossip or exaggeration. Looking back now, many believe her emotional and physical health may have been deteriorating simultaneously. And then came the terrifying public footage that spread across social media. Videos of Celine struggling physically during appearances caused enormous concern online. Some clips showed stiffness in her movements. Others captured moments where she appeared physically uncomfortable simply walking. Fans who had watched her perform effortlessly for decades were shocked. The contrast was painful. This was the same woman who once dominated massive stages for hours at a time without showing weakness. Now even standing comfortably appeared difficult. Yet despite everything, Celine continued trying to reassure her fans. That may be one of the saddest aspects of her story. Even while suffering intensely, she focused on comforting other people instead of herself. She repeatedly thanked fans for their support and emphasized that she was fighting hard to recover. But beneath those hopeful words was a reality nobody could ignore anymore. Her life had changed forever. Doctors have explained that stiff person syndrome is extremely rare and unpredictable. Symptoms can worsen under stress, emotional pressure, or physical exhaustion. For a performer whose entire existence revolved around live performance, travel, rehearsals, and emotional intensity, the diagnosis was devastating on every level. And sadly, the disease does not only affect the body. It can affect the mind emotionally too. People living with chronic neurological disorders often experience anxiety, depression, fear, and isolation as their independence slowly changes. Many fans fear Celine has been enduring exactly that behind closed doors. Especially because her entire adult life was built around being strong for others. Strong for her audience. Strong for her children. Strong for René. Strong for the cameras. But eventually, even the strongest people reach a breaking point. One of the most emotional moments came when fans saw how protective her sons became around her during recent public appearances. Observers noticed the quiet support system surrounding her, family members helping guide her physically and emotionally through difficult moments. For longtime fans, it was almost unbearable to witness, because it forced people to confront something they never wanted to imagine. Céline Dion was no longer invincible, and perhaps she never truly was. Behind the legendary voice was always a woman carrying enormous emotional weight. A woman who spent decades sacrificing her own well-being to fulfill expectations placed upon her by fame, family, and loyalty. Some entertainment analysts now believe Celine pushed herself far too hard for far too long. The Las Vegas residency alone demanded extraordinary physical endurance year after year. Constant touring, endless performances, emotional stress, grief, and public pressure may have slowly drained her physically and mentally. Yet she rarely allowed the public to see weakness. That was the role she had trained herself to play. Even now, fans continue holding on to hope that she may one day return to performing in some capacity. And perhaps she will. But the heartbreaking reality is that her battle is far more serious than many initially realized. This is no temporary setback. This is a woman fighting to preserve basic parts of the life she once controlled effortlessly. And for millions of fans who grew up believing Céline Dion could overcome anything, watching her endure this painful chapter has become almost impossible to watch without emotion. What makes the downfall of Céline Dion feel so emotionally devastating is not simply the illness itself. It is the contrast between who she once was and what she is now forced to endure. For decades, Celine represented absolute control. Control of her voice. Control of the stage. Control of emotion. Every performance felt flawless. She could hold impossible notes with precision, while simultaneously making audiences cry. Other singers admired her technique, but fans connected to something even deeper: her emotional honesty. When Celine sang about heartbreak, people believed her completely. Now many fans believe that pain was never just performance. It was real. Looking back, there were signs throughout her career that emotional suffering followed her long before the diagnosis became public. Despite all her success, Celine often spoke about fear, anxiety, and emotional dependency in interviews. She admitted repeatedly that René Angélil was the center of her world. Not just her husband, her entire foundation. That kind of emotional reliance can become dangerous when loss arrives. And when René died, something inside Celine appeared to collapse permanently. People close to the singer reportedly noticed dramatic emotional changes afterward. She continued performing because she believed it was what René would have wanted, but insiders claimed the grief never truly left her. Some even described her as emotionally lost behind the scenes, forcing herself through public appearances while privately struggling to cope. Fans began noticing it too. There were moments during concerts where Celine appeared overwhelmed with emotion. Sometimes she paused unexpectedly. Sometimes tears filled her eyes during songs that previously seemed effortless for her to perform. At the time, audiences saw vulnerability. Now many see grief slowly consuming her in real time. And sadly, the pressure surrounding her never disappeared. That is one of the cruelest realities of global fame. Even when celebrities are suffering, the machine around them keeps moving. Contracts continue. Expectations remain. Public attention never fully stops. Millions of people still wanted Céline Dion to be Céline Dion every single night, regardless of what she was enduring personally. So she kept going, again and again, until her body finally refused. One particularly heartbreaking aspect of her story is how deeply she appeared to fear disappointing fans. Even while canceling shows due to serious medical complications, her public statements consistently focused on apologizing to audiences rather than expressing frustration about her own suffering. That tells people everything about who she was. Even during personal collapse, she worried about others first. Fans around the world responded emotionally after learning more about stiff person syndrome. Many admitted they had never even heard of the condition before Celine spoke publicly about it. The disorder is incredibly rare, affecting only a tiny number of people worldwide, which made the diagnosis feel even more tragic and isolating. And unlike temporary injuries, this condition can fundamentally alter everyday life. Simple activities become difficult. Walking can become painful. Muscles may suddenly spasm without warning. Stress can intensify symptoms dramatically. For an ordinary person, that reality would already feel terrifying. But for someone whose career depended on physical precision and vocal control, it became catastrophic. Some medical experts explained that even singing itself could potentially trigger complications depending on muscle involvement and stress levels. That revelation devastated fans who could not imagine a world where Céline Dion might never fully perform again. The thought felt almost unthinkable. And yet, as more footage emerged over recent years, concern continued growing. Fans analyzed every appearance carefully. Social media filled with emotional comments from people worried about her health. Some videos showed her walking slowly and cautiously. Others captured visible discomfort in her posture and movements. There were also moments that deeply disturbed longtime supporters emotionally. In several appearances, Celine seemed unusually thin and physically fragile. Online speculation exploded. Some people cruelly criticized her appearance without understanding the medical and emotional battles happening behind the scenes. But loyal fans defended her fiercely. Because beneath the gossip and headlines was a woman enduring extraordinary suffering while trying to maintain dignity in front of the world. And perhaps that dignity is what makes her story hurt even more. Despite everything she has lost, Celine rarely appears bitter publicly. She speaks carefully. She thanks supporters constantly. She expresses hope even while describing painful realities about her condition. But there are moments when the sadness becomes impossible to hide, especially when she speaks about singing. Anyone who watches her closely can see it immediately. Music is not simply something she did. It is who she is. Losing the ability to perform normally is not like changing careers or stepping away from a profession. For Céline Dion, it is like losing a part of her soul. That is why so many fans became emotional during the release of recent documentaries and interviews surrounding her health battle. For the first time, audiences were seeing the human being behind the icon, frightened, exhausted, vulnerable, and physically struggling. The illusion of invincibility was gone, and what replaced it was heartbreaking honesty. Some of the most emotional reactions came from older fans who had followed her career for decades. Many said it felt like watching a family member suffer. Her music had been present during major moments of their lives for so long that seeing her in pain created a deeply personal emotional response. Few celebrities inspire that kind of connection. But Celine always did. Because underneath the fame, she never fully lost the emotional sincerity people connected with from the beginning. She was never the cool, untouchable celebrity type. She cried openly. She laughed loudly. She expressed love intensely. She wore her heart publicly in ways many stars avoid. And now, that same openness has exposed the depth of her suffering to the world. The heartbreaking truth is that many people only fully appreciated how much Céline Dion gave to audiences after watching her lose the very abilities that made her legendary. And today, millions of fans are left confronting a painful reality they never wanted to face. Even the strongest voices can eventually break. As Céline Dion disappeared more frequently from public life, a strange sadness began spreading among her fans. It was not the kind of celebrity gossip cycle people normally see when stars step away from the spotlight. This felt different, more personal, more painful, because people were not simply watching a singer cancel concerts. They were watching a symbol of strength slowly struggle to survive. For decades, Celine represented endurance. No matter what happened in her life, she always returned to the stage. Grief, exhaustion, heartbreak, pressure, none of it stopped her for long. She performed through emotional devastation that would have destroyed most people privately. That is why her absence suddenly felt so alarming. For perhaps the first time in her entire career, fans realized there was no quick recovery coming. And behind the scenes, reports suggested the emotional toll had become overwhelming. Sources close to Celine claimed she experienced periods of deep frustration and sadness as her condition worsened. Not only because of physical pain, but because of what the illness was taking away from her psychologically. Imagine spending your entire life mastering something, only to wake up one day unable to trust your own body anymore. That loss changes a person emotionally. Especially someone like Celine, whose identity was built almost entirely around performance and connection. One of the most heartbreaking realities of chronic illness is that the public usually sees only fragments of the suffering. Fans see official statements, short appearances, carefully edited interviews. But they do not see the quiet moments afterward. The fear, the exhaustion, the humiliation of losing independence, the loneliness. And according to people familiar with her situation, Celine faced all of those things privately, while trying to remain emotionally present for her children at the same time. That responsibility alone reportedly became incredibly difficult. After René Angélil's death, Celine focused intensely on being strong for her sons. Friends described her as fiercely protective and deeply devoted to keeping the family emotionally together despite her grief. But carrying emotional pain while simultaneously acting as the emotional anchor for everyone else eventually becomes unsustainable. Some fans now believe Celine spent most of her life suppressing her own suffering to protect other people. Protecting René, protecting her children, protecting audiences, protecting her image. And eventually, the emotional pressure may have become too heavy for even her to carry. Another heartbreaking element of her story is how rapidly public perception changed once people realized how serious her condition truly was. For years, tabloids mocked her appearance, questioned her weight, and spread rumors about her health. Social media became especially cruel at times. People speculated endlessly without understanding the truth. Then suddenly, after the diagnosis became public, those same images looked completely different. Fans revisited photographs and videos with guilt, realizing the woman being criticized had likely been battling severe physical suffering privately all along. That realization hit many people hard emotionally. Because Celine never used her illness to seek sympathy before going public. In fact, she hid much of the struggle for as long as possible. According to reports, She desperately hoped treatments and therapy might allow her to return to normal performance life before fans fully realized what was happening. But the condition continued progressing, and eventually, hiding the truth became impossible. The emotional video announcement where she finally revealed her diagnosis devastated audiences worldwide. Fans immediately noticed how difficult it seemed for her to speak about the situation. She tried to remain calm and hopeful, but beneath the professionalism was visible heartbreak. This was not simply a celebrity discussing a medical setback. This was a woman confronting the possible loss of the one thing that gave her life meaning. And perhaps nobody understood that pain more deeply than Celine herself. Because unlike many stars who treat fame as business, Celine's connection to music always appeared deeply emotional and personal. Singing was how she processed grief. It was how she connected with people. It was how she survived emotionally after René's death. Now even that escape was being threatened. Fans especially noticed how emotional she became whenever discussing the possibility of returning to the stage. There was desperation beneath her optimism, almost as if she could not fully imagine a future without performing. That fear is understandable. When someone spends nearly their entire life being celebrated for one extraordinary gift, losing access to that gift can create an identity crisis far beyond career disappointment. It changes how they see themselves entirely. And sadly, many former performers who lose physical abilities often experience intense emotional suffering afterward. Depression, isolation, anxiety, and grief become common because the world they once controlled disappears almost overnight. Some observers worry Celine may be experiencing exactly that privately, especially because so much of her emotional support system disappeared years ago with René's death. There were also rumors that the stress surrounding her health battle became emotionally draining for those closest to her as well. Caring for someone with a rare neurological disorder can be exhausting physically and psychologically. The unpredictability alone creates constant anxiety. Will symptoms worsen today? Will walking become difficult? Will spasms suddenly appear? Will performing ever be possible again? Nobody truly knows. And that uncertainty may be one of the cruelest aspects of all. Still, despite everything, Celine continues fighting. That resilience continues inspiring millions of people around the world dealing with illness, grief, or personal suffering. Fans constantly share stories online about how her honesty helped them feel less alone during their own battles. Ironically, even while physically weakened, Céline Dion may now be emotionally impacting people more deeply than ever before. Because the image is no longer perfection. It is survival. And perhaps that is why her story feels so heartbreaking today. Not because people are watching a superstar fall, but because they are finally seeing the vulnerable human being who was hiding behind the legendary voice all along. For many fans, the most painful part of Céline Dion's story is realizing how much of her life was built around sacrifice. From the very beginning, she sacrificed privacy for fame. Then she sacrificed rest for success. Later, she sacrificed her own emotional stability to care for René Angélil during his final years. And now, at a stage in life when many performers finally begin slowing down peacefully, she finds herself fighting one of the cruelest battles imaginable, a battle against her own body. That reality has left millions of fans emotionally devastated. Because Céline Dion never seemed like someone who deserved this kind of ending. Unlike many celebrities surrounded by scandals and controversy, Celine built her reputation around sincerity, loyalty, and hard work. Even people who were not fans of her music often respected the discipline and emotional authenticity she brought to her career, which makes the tragedy feel even more unfair. Over the years, countless stories emerged from people who worked with her behind the scenes. Staff members, musicians, and industry insiders frequently described her as surprisingly kind, emotional, and generous despite her enormous fame. Many said she treated workers respectfully and remained deeply connected to her family roots even after becoming one of the most recognizable women in the world. But behind that warmth was also someone carrying enormous emotional pressure almost constantly. Perfection became expected from her. Not requested. Expected. Every live performance had to be extraordinary. Every note had to sound flawless. Every appearance had to maintain the image audiences loved for decades. And because Celine cared deeply about disappointing people, she pushed herself relentlessly to meet those expectations. Some entertainment analysts now believe that lifestyle came with a devastating physical and emotional cost. The Las Vegas residency alone required unbelievable endurance. Night after night, year after year, she delivered emotionally demanding performances under extreme pressure. Add international travel, interviews, rehearsals, grief, and constant public attention, and it becomes easier to understand how deeply exhausted she may have become over time. Yet she almost never publicly complained. That silence became part of her identity too. Fans admired her strength because she always appeared capable of surviving anything. But strength can become dangerous when it convinces people they are not allowed to break down. And eventually, the body forces the truth into the open. One especially heartbreaking detail about Celine's illness is how unpredictable it appears to be. Some days reportedly feel manageable. Other days become extremely difficult physically. That uncertainty creates a psychological burden many healthy people struggle to fully understand. Imagine waking up unsure whether your own muscles will cooperate normally. Imagine fearing sudden spasms or stiffness during ordinary moments. Imagine losing confidence in your own body after spending decades depending on it professionally. That fear alone can become emotionally exhausting. And for a global superstar constantly watched by the public, the pressure intensifies even more. Fans noticed that after her diagnosis became public, Celine's rare appearances carried an entirely different emotional weight. Every photograph sparked concern. Every video clip became headline news. People analyzed her movements carefully, desperately trying to determine whether she looked healthier or weaker. In some ways, it must feel suffocating, because while millions genuinely care about her, constant public observation can also become emotionally draining for someone trying to heal privately. Yet despite all this, Celine still attempts to project hope whenever possible. That determination became especially emotional during appearances connected to her documentary and health updates. Even while discussing painful realities, she continued emphasizing gratitude, resilience, and love for her supporters. But there were moments where the emotional cracks became impossible to hide, particularly when she spoke about the future. Fans could hear uncertainty in her voice. Not just fear about performing again, fear about what her life now looks like without the certainty she once had. For decades, her future always revolved around music. Tours, albums, performances, audiences. That structure gave her purpose and direction. Now everything feels uncertain, and uncertainty can emotionally destroy even very strong people. Another reason her story resonates so deeply is because many people see parts of themselves in her suffering. Loss, grief, aging, physical decline, fear of losing identity, fear of becoming dependent on others. These are universal human fears, and Céline Dion is experiencing them publicly in front of the entire world. That vulnerability transformed her from a distant superstar into something much more personal for audiences. A human being struggling to hold on to herself. Fans also became emotional watching how fiercely she continues trying to remain connected to music despite the illness. Reports suggest she still spends time focusing on vocal work, therapy, and rehabilitation whenever possible. Even after everything she has endured, she has not emotionally given up on singing. That determination says everything about how deeply music lives inside her. But sadly, determination alone cannot always defeat physical reality. And many fans are beginning to accept the painful possibility that the version of Céline Dion they grew up watching may never fully return. No more endless world tours. No more physically demanding stage performances. No more effortless vocal domination night after night. Instead, what remains is something far more fragile, and perhaps far more real. A woman trying to survive unimaginable emotional and physical pain with dignity. And maybe that is why recent footage of Celine affects people so strongly online. It is not merely sadness over illness. It is grief over watching time and suffering transform someone who once seemed eternal. Because for an entire generation, Céline Dion's voice felt permanent, untouchable, almost superhuman. But today, fans are being forced to confront a heartbreaking truth nobody wanted to believe. Even legends are human in the end. As the years pass, one painful question continues haunting fans of Céline Dion around the world. How much more can she endure? It is a question filled with sadness because Celine's life already seems defined by emotional survival. Again and again, she has been forced to carry unimaginable burdens while remaining graceful in front of millions of people. Most individuals facing devastating grief would retreat from public life completely. Most people battling a rare neurological disorder would understandably disappear from the spotlight to protect themselves emotionally. But Celine never fully learned how to stop fighting. That relentless determination is inspiring, but also deeply tragic. Because many fans now worry she spent so much of her life being strong for others that she never truly allowed herself to heal personally. After René Angélil died, observers noticed something subtle but heartbreaking in the way Celine spoke publicly. She often sounded emotionally suspended in time, as though part of her still could not accept that he was gone. Even years later, interviews about him frequently triggered visible emotion. Some grief experts explain that when a relationship becomes the emotional center of someone's entire adult life, losing that person can fundamentally alter identity itself. And for Celine, René was not simply a husband. He was woven into every chapter of her existence. He discovered her, guided her, protected her, helped build her career, shared her triumphs, helped shape her confidence. When he disappeared, the emotional void left behind may have been impossible to fully replace. That grief alone would have been overwhelming. But then came the illness. Fans sometimes forget how psychologically cruel chronic disease can become over time. Physical suffering is only one part of the battle. The emotional exhaustion often becomes just as destructive, especially when symptoms begin stealing away independence. Simple things most people never think about suddenly become complicated. Standing, walking, sleeping comfortably, moving naturally, trusting your own muscles, living without fear of pain or spasms. For someone once celebrated worldwide for physical control and vocal precision, those losses become emotionally devastating. And perhaps the saddest part is this. Celine understands exactly what she is losing. That awareness can be unbearable. Many celebrities slowly fade from public attention due to age or changing popularity. But Celine's situation feels different because audiences are watching someone still deeply loved by millions being physically pulled away from the thing she loves most. Not by scandal, not by failure, not by lack of talent, but by illness. And there is something profoundly heartbreaking about that. Fans became especially emotional during the rare moments where Celine appeared in public despite obvious physical struggle. The applause she received carried a completely different feeling than before. It was no longer only admiration for her talent. It was support for her survival. People were no longer simply cheering for a singer. They were cheering for a human being fighting through pain. Some viewers even admitted they cried watching her recent appearances because the contrast felt overwhelming. Memories of the powerful woman dominating stadiums collided painfully with the fragile figure now moving carefully through public spaces. But despite everything, there are still flashes of the old Celine. Moments where her humor returns. Moments where her smile briefly looks genuine again. Moments where her spirit still shines through the suffering. And those moments matter deeply to fans. Because they remind people that beneath the illness, beneath the grief, beneath the exhaustion, the woman they admired for decades is still there fighting to hold on to herself. At the same time, however, many supporters fear the emotional cost of continuing public life may be enormous. Fame becomes far more complicated when illness enters the picture. Every appearance generates headlines. Every movement gets analyzed online. Every facial expression becomes part of public discussion. That level of scrutiny can become emotionally exhausting for healthy celebrities, let alone someone already fighting physically and psychologically every day. Some fans have even expressed concern that people continue pressuring Celine to return too quickly because they miss the icon she once was. But illness does not care about nostalgia. Recovery does not happen according to public demand. And in some cases, complete recovery may never fully arrive. That reality has become increasingly difficult for fans to accept, especially because Céline Dion represented emotional certainty for so many years. Her voice felt timeless, reliable, immovable. When people heard her sing, it felt like hearing pure emotional power untouched by weakness. Now weakness is exactly what the world sees. And strangely, it may have made audiences love her even more. Because vulnerability reveals humanity. For perhaps the first time in her career, fans are not connecting only with the superstar version of Céline Dion. They are connecting with the frightened, grieving, exhausted woman underneath the fame. A woman who spent her life giving strength to others while quietly running out of strength herself. That realization changes how people hear her music now. Songs that once sounded romantic suddenly feel tragic. Lyrics about loss feel painfully real. Performances once viewed as technically brilliant now seem emotionally haunted. Everything carries heavier meaning, because audiences now understand how much pain she may have been hiding behind the scenes for years. And maybe that is the cruelest truth of all. Some of Celine Dion's most powerful performances may have happened while she was silently suffering in ways nobody around her fully understood. Today, fans around the world continue hoping for miracles, hoping treatments improve, hoping her pain eases, hoping she finds moments of peace despite everything she has endured. But no matter what happens next, one thing has already become painfully clear. The tragedy of Celine Dion is not simply about illness. It is about a woman who gave her entire heart to the world until there was almost nothing left for herself. Today, when people look at Celine Dion, they no longer see only one of the greatest singers in history. They see survival. They see grief. They see exhaustion. And perhaps most painfully of all, they see a woman who spent her entire life trying to stay strong while quietly falling apart behind the scenes. That is why her story has affected so many people emotionally in recent years. The tragedy surrounding Celine Dion does not feel distant or artificial like typical celebrity drama. It feels painfully human. Almost everyone understands some part of what she is going through. Fear of losing health, fear of losing identity, fear of facing life after devastating loss. But very few people must endure those fears while the entire world watches. And that may be the cruelest burden fame can create. For decades, Celine's voice seemed larger than life itself. Her songs became emotional landmarks for millions of people across generations. Weddings played her music. Funerals played her music. People listened to her during heartbreak, illness, loneliness, and personal tragedy. Her voice became associated with emotional survival. Ironically, while she was helping other people endure pain, she was silently accumulating enormous pain of her own. Looking back now, many fans believe the world misunderstood Celine Dion completely. People saw glamour. They saw fame. They saw money and applause. But they did not fully see the emotional cost. Very few noticed how much of her identity revolved around giving pieces of herself away constantly, to audiences, to the music industry, to her family, and especially to René Angélil. She dedicated herself completely to the people she loved, often at the expense of her own emotional well-being. And eventually, life demanded more from her than any person should reasonably have to carry. The death of René alone might have emotionally shattered someone forever. But Celine kept moving because she believed she had to. Then came the physical suffering. Then came the terrifying realization that even music, the one thing that always saved her emotionally, might no longer be fully accessible to her. Imagine the psychological devastation of that moment. Imagine realizing your body can no longer do the thing that gave your life purpose. That fear lives in every recent appearance she makes. Fans can see it in her eyes sometimes. Beneath the smiles and gratitude, there is visible sadness, almost as if she is mourning the version of herself she once was. Not because she lacks courage, but because she understands exactly what this illness has taken away from her. And yet, despite everything, Celine continues showing extraordinary grace. She still thanks supporters. She still speaks with love. She still tries to inspire hope, even while enduring one of the darkest periods of her life. That resilience is why audiences remain so emotionally attached to her story. People are not simply mourning the decline of a celebrity. They are witnessing someone fight desperately to preserve dignity, identity, and meaning while facing circumstances completely beyond her control. And sadly, many fans believe Celine spent too much of her life carrying emotional pain alone. Some now wonder whether the pressure to always appear strong prevented her from fully processing grief and exhaustion over the years. Fame rewarded her for endurance. Audiences celebrated her ability to keep performing through suffering. The industry admired her professionalism, no matter what personal storms surrounded her life. But strength has limits. Every human being eventually reaches a point where pain can no longer remain hidden. And when Celine finally revealed the truth about her illness, the emotional reaction worldwide was immediate and overwhelming. Millions of people suddenly understood that the woman they had admired for decades was far more fragile than anyone realized. Not weak, never weak, but human, painfully human. That distinction matters, because Celine Dion's story is ultimately not about defeat. It is about the terrifying vulnerability that exists beneath greatness. The world tends to view legendary performers as symbols rather than ordinary people. Fans imagine they are somehow protected from the struggles everyone else faces. But illness does not care about fame. Grief does not care about talent. Loss does not care about success. And even the most extraordinary voices can eventually be silenced by suffering. Perhaps that is why recent footage of Celine affects people so deeply online. It forces audiences to confront mortality, aging, fragility, and emotional exhaustion in a way they cannot easily ignore. Watching someone once viewed as nearly invincible struggle physically creates an emotional shock many fans are still trying to process. Because for decades, Céline Dion felt eternal. Now she feels heartbreakingly fragile. Still, even through all the sadness, there remains something undeniably beautiful about the way people continue supporting her. Fans around the world constantly share memories connected to her music. They post emotional tributes online. They celebrate her courage. They pray for her recovery. Some even describe her as inspirational now, in a completely different way than before. Not because she is performing perfectly, but because she continues fighting despite imperfection. And maybe that is the final tragedy and final beauty of Céline Dion's story. The world spent decades admiring her voice, but only now are people truly beginning to understand the depth of the woman behind it. A woman who endured grief, pressure, sacrifice, loneliness, illness, and emotional devastation, yet still tried to give love to the world until the very end. And for millions of fans watching her painful journey today, one heartbreaking truth has become impossible to ignore. At 58, the tragedy of Céline Dion is not simply beyond heartbreaking. It is the story of a legend who gave everything she had away and paid an unimaginable personal price for it.